You are watching NovaNow.tv, independent community media for Northern Virginia.
Hey everybody, glad you all came out. I hope, I'm pretty sure at the end of this you'll have some good information that you'll be able to talk to your friends about. I'm going to go through a couple basic things. What's the NSABA, how do we get started, etc. Give you a little background on me, then we'll jump right into the CRT stuff and some of the other information that we can pass out. And kind of the purpose of this is that the narrative on critical race theory is so convoluted that it makes it very difficult to discuss it, right? And every time an individual addresses this critical race theory, there's usually a pushback that it's not really critical race theory. I even had some friends of mine, this is a Harvard JD, he was scolding, he called me up to scold me that it wasn't critical race theory was only used in jurisprudence. So I did a copy from the book that we both had read on critical race theory and sent him the paragraph to contradict his argument. And he hung up and he hasn't talked to me since, but. So the NSABA, it's called the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans. I started this in the aftermath of all of the riots, et cetera, only because I felt that BLM and the NAACP existed on a false narrative. And that what they called out as was based on race, looking at the data and all the data around it, it was not race, there's something else going on. And I'll talk about what that other thing is going on. We've been working over the last year from an education standpoint, developing, we have a thing called the Summer Essentials Academy. So basically we look at what we call Black poverty clusters, okay? So when you look at American poverty, wherever you have a cluster of African Americans in poverty, you'll have a ring of Latino clusters and white clusters. And in terms of academic performance, they're normalized. What do I mean by that? All of you may know that Baltimore City has a terrible graduation rate, right? 25% don't graduate. The Black graduation is 73%, roughly. Well, what they don't talk about is the white graduation rate is 72%. And the Hispanic graduating rate is 54%, right? So what the data says, and we've run this against Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, the only major city in the United States where there's underperformance, where there's a big gap in underperformance between white and black students is Washington, D.C. And it's because that city has a whole side that's wealthy and a whole side that's poor. It's highly segregated. And so you get the differences there. So that was part of the false narrative that annoyed me to the point where I'm saying, we have to have a counter message to BLM. I'm not a guy for protesting and jumping in the streets and yelling and burning down neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a data guy, and I think that you have to look at facts, data, and history in order to come up with real solutions. And I'm gonna skip through some of this stuff. Oh, we do a thing, we do a couple of different programs. We do weekend study camps, we train people. One of the biggest things that we found in terms of mapping education outcomes, there was a drop-off of among seventh graders that was typical across a number of different districts. The popular conclusion was that the kids were just going through puberty and that was it. Turned out that wasn't the case. What was actually happening is that talented kids usually had a drop-off in academic performance if their parents had not gone to college. And the reason for this is that they went through elementary school on talent and never learned how to study. So when the material became more complicated, their grades dropped off and they underperformed just because they were smart. And many of these children were classified as having some kind of a learning disorder. They were basically excused as just hormones or this, but that wasn't the case. They never learned to say they didn't have the skills. So we started running these weekend study camps during the school year, and we'll have it here. We'll be actually having them in Fairfax starting next year, where basically we bring kids in and we give them a learning coach, and we teach them the discipline of study. You know, how to memorize, et cetera, how to go through books, go through literacy. Another big thing that we focused on this part, these were 2 projects in Pennsylvania, had to do with dropout recovery, right? So the number one reason why kids dropped out of school was because they felt they were too far behind to catch up. So our programs were designed so that they never got to that point. So we gave them assessment-based remediation starting in like the seventh grade so that they wouldn't get like a learning deficit. And I'll give you a quick example and I'll keep moving on. For example, a child that was struggling in math usually had a problem learning new math when they did not know like multiplication readily. Why? When the teacher describes, say, a quadratic equation, 30% of the kid's attention is trying to solve the math in the problem. And so they're not really listening. So we had camps where we drilled them to get them to have quarter-second responses on simple operations, and it helped improve their grades by 1-2 grades because they would sit in that class and they were actually paying attention. Very, very simple, minute new things and observations that we looked through. And Learn to Learn, that's a video series that's coming on, and I'll skip that stuff. You can read it. I'm gonna put these out for everyone to see. My background is, I guess, I don't know if it's typical, it is what it is. Son of a African Methodist minister, made about $8,000 a year. My mother did domestic services. She was just a maid for different people. She was born on the same plantation that my family were slaves on, and left when she was 17 to go north with her 15-year-old sister during what was called the Great Migration. So we bounced. My dad was a civil rights minister. He went into churches that were in disarray, did reorganization of finances. So before I was in the 6th grade, I've been to 13 different elementary schools. There were pushback, and this is to say that I know what racism looks like, and what we have today is not racism. I had situations that my dad asked them to do a tire rotation. They put on all new tires, told him to pay for it. When he said no, he called the police and they put him in jail. When I was in kindergarten, this kid said he was my friend, and I said there was a shortcut through a white housing project. I got to the middle of it, about 8 kids came out with cinder blocks and tried to beat me to death. Broke my arm, went home, hospital wouldn't take me. My dad set my arm on the kitchen table. No police were called. Swelling went down, I was back in school. That was on a Friday, I was back in school on Monday with a newspaper taped around my arm as a cast. It was just that typical. I went to the 1st grade at the same time. I had a cousin that would encourage me, had the same kindergarten teacher. He turned up dead on the lake outside of Mount Vernon, Illinois. They said he drowned, but he was in the boat. So that's the kind of, so this is early 70s, that kind of thing, 60s, early 70s. I've had situations, my brother came home one day, I opened the front door, he wasn't responding. He didn't seem to know who he was. He said, "Oh, I think I live here." Turns out in school, Rock Island, East St. Louis, a bunch of guys tried to strangle him. They thought he was dead and left him, and in shock, he made his way home. Birmingham, Alabama, this is about 1974. Some of the same people that were upset with my mom was at work. They came in, busted in doors, trashed stuff. We were in hiding in Birmingham for 2 weeks. And then my family was broken up. The younger ones were sent to Mississippi on my grandmother's farm. 2 of my brothers were sent north to Illinois to a children's home. And my dad was just trying to find a church. So we were homeless for the better part of that year. I ended up getting sick, so they had to put me in an orphanage in Illinois so I could get medical care. I had these lesions and precancers. I had to have treatment, et cetera, et cetera. So I know what it's like. I know what it looks like. Went to school there, fought every day. Knife wound on my left-hand side, got that when I was 9. So I know what it looks like. I know what it feels like, and this ain't it. Past that stuff, but the good, the good and the bad came along. We came to Pennsylvania. My dad got a church there. He said, "Enough of this, I'm not doing this anymore. It's gonna destroy my kids." Get there, and within 8 months of us being there, he dies of cancer. My dad's friends, they decided that I would be that I might go the wrong way if I wasn't busy. So I took this test and I applied to a school and they gave me all the money to go. They sent me to a private boarding school. I got there, did terrible for about the first 6 months, got pneumonia in the hospital for 6 weeks, got out, but in the hospital I figured out something. I remember my dad told me, these kids aren't smarter than you, they just don't know how to learn. So I made friends with the 5 smartest kids in my class. I went to synagogue with the one guy every Saturday. I had sleepovers, and it turned out it was right. They knew how to study. It was a lack of that knowledge that was holding me back, right? Taking the CEO of Dentco, one of the largest dental companies in the world, that was my best friend growing up. He taught me chess, taught me how to study. His dad lectured me endlessly, and it wasn't my race. I was the first black person admitted to that school. So they did some silly thing where they had a racial awareness class. I'm like, really? You got one guy in this school and you're gonna have a class for me. But it turned out to be amusing. We made through it. So that's just the background. To let you know that's why I care about this. And the primary tenet of critical race theory is that the system is rigged against you, or rigged against some people. And while a lot of people think that's new, that has been the primary recruiting line for gangs for a decade. In my career, I would take every 7th year off to volunteer in the worst school system I could find. I was in Gary, Indiana for 2 years. I didn't travel in to meet with the kids. I bought a house across the street from the high school. And during that time, I lost 2 kids. One kid got shot in the head 30 feet from my front door. Had another kid, worked at McDonald's. Gangbangers came through, ordered a meal. When he gave the meal out the window, shot him in the head. Want to know why they shot him? Because they got college scholarships. And they didn't want the rest of the other kids to have hope that they could get out of it. Their message was hopelessness. I did that in Roxbury, Mattapan, South Chicago. I would go and I would take the subway just to listen to people. Just right up and down, listen to what the parents were talking about, listen to what the kids were talking about. And I can tell you that the core messages of the system's rigged against you created a mindset where they basically said, why should I work hard to get anything done if I'm not going to get anywhere anyway? And then the gangbangers would come up and say, you know what? I can get you easy money now, right here in the neighborhood. So I was triggered when this CRT stuff started to pick up. Other background, so went to high school, did well in academics, that kind of thing. Ended up, I did get a seat at West Point. I decided not to go. I had a football scholarship with William Mary. I turned that down. They were pissed. And I got into Harvard College. I originally majored in theology, but then I switched to engineering and computer science. I did that work. After that, went to the military. I was 3 years active duty, and I was telling gentlemen here about what I did there. I was in the field at Fort Bragg in what they call Special Troops Battalion, and I was having fun. But I ended up injuring my back. I broke my back, and I blew out a knee. So I ended up in Virginia at Walter Reed in therapy for 3 years. When I got here, they basically said, why were you ever running around the woods doing that stuff? So I became an instructor at the Defense Systems Management College. One of my positions, I was in the Automation Steering Committee for the college when the Army was the executive agent for total quality management of the government. So I did a lot of training, a lot of teaching. I developed and taught the graduate course of computer literacy for the program manager's office. And then I ran a lab that looked at civilian technology for adaptation for DoD uses, the idea that it was cheaper to use commercial technology, do some adaptive stuff, and then take it from there. So that was kind of my first foray with education, but it was education and technology. Part of that is we had what we call the Star Wars room, and part of our mandate was to experiment in education technology to try to make, because the amount of data coming into DoD was massive. And in those days, it was considered a lack of leadership to have a computer on your desk. you gave it to your secretary and she printed out your email and gave it to you. The Army was saying, we need to stop this. So we went through all that. I've been a semiconductor engineer. By career, I'm an architect. And I look at systems, complex systems, and design solutions. I've done it for medicine. I've done it for DoD. I've done it for the tobacco industry. I did major systems deployment in all of the pharma companies. And I've done medical, Kaiser Permanente. I did the remediation for their hospital systems. And I ran, and I was the subject matter expert for the FDA, the EPA, in terms of document management, processes, workflow, those kinds of things for about 7 years. So we'll skip, that's all the boring stuff. Skip the boring stuff. Got a bunch of medals, yada, 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 yada. Okay, CRT, critical race theory. So CRT comes from something called critical theory, right? So when it says here that it's an approach in social philosophy that focuses on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal challenge power structures. And I won't read the rest, you can read that. That's a bunch of fancy words. But basically, it is simply, critical theory was applied in law to say, there's been a crime. Okay, let me look at this crime as if I'm a prosecutor. Now let me look as if I'm a victim, or if I'm a defense attorney. At its heart, critical theory is just taking the world you see and applying a lens you choose. Okay? Critical race theory is just taking the world you see, assuming that all power structures are governed by race. And then the body of literature and vocabulary and everything emerges from that. And it is their way of basically creating a vocabulary around an assumption, because once you know that vocabulary and use that vocabulary, it infers the acceptance of the assumption. And we're all victims of it, right? They've given us a definition for racism, and they start there. Almost no one ever disagrees when they say, is there racism in American society? Everyone says yes. And we go from there. Martin Luther King made a distinction. There's racism and there's racial discrimination, and they're not the same thing. Racism is a feeling and a thought. Racial discrimination is an action. In the early civil rights movements, they weren't concerned about the thoughts. They were only concerned about the actions. So that's where we got the civil rights legislation. It was to make illegal racist actions, discrimination. Martin Luther King never worried about the racism itself. In his view, by integrating, people would get to know each other, and that part would take care of itself. And that was the point of desegregation. So this is so they say it's a theoretical framework or a set of perspectives by which structural and institutional racism, mark that word, may be examined. It developed as an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who sought to critically examine U.S. law as it intersects with issues of race in the U.S. and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. CRT examines social, cultural, legal issues as they relate to race and racism in the United States. A lot of words, but basically this is what they did. A black kid gets arrested in the inner city for some crime. Without this quote unquote CRT approach, you say, you robbed a store with a gun, you're going to jail. When you apply the CRT lens to it, it says, you robbed a store with a gun, maybe you're going to jail. What's happening at home? Who set you off the week before? What do you feel about this? Did you rob that store owner because you felt some animus towards the store owner because you're Asian or some other culture, right? So initially it was an effort in the legal world to just put context to crimes that were committed. And that was pretty much it. But it was quickly expanded to go beyond just the legal treatise. So you will get, when people talk about critical race theory, And when they do the denial and they say it's only a legal theory, they're wrong. And they're wrong because in their own books, CRT was expanded, right? So although CRT began as a movement in law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of what? School discipline, hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies over curricula, and historical, bilingual, and multicultural education, and alternative charter schools. Now, you see that reference to the foundations of critical race theory in education? That is the definitive text that critical race theorists use in their discipline. They are saying they're in education. It's not an assertion or some conspiracy. They are saying it, and they have a body of discipline and books and guides and training all built around it, and a vocabulary. So this is a quote from their book. They, CRT and education writers, discuss the rise of biological racism in education theory practice and urge attention to the resegregation of American schools. Some question the Anglo-centric curricula and change that many educators apply a deficit theory approaching schooling for minority kids. So when you hear about kids wanting racially separated safe spaces, it is a tenet of CRT in education where the ultimate goal is resegregation. In their view, they see it like an all-girls school. You know, if you give the girls a school, they'll act different, they'll express themselves different, they'll feel more powerful, yada, 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 yada. In their mind, have a black school, have a white school, separate them all out, and you separate the oppressors from the oppressed, right? So CRT is an approach of viewing different disciplines from one assumption. It is not based on any data or social science at all. There's no evidence-based studies that of how CRT impacts education. In other words, these concepts are being rolled in, but there is no clinical data that says what effects this will have on children. None. CRT is not taught as curricula. It is implemented in education through the indoctrination of teachers and staff to its tenets. Teachers then teach their class through the lens that everybody's a racist. So it comes out in side comments. It comes out in how they treat different students in the classroom, how they tolerate different pieces of the classroom, how they respond to disciplinary issues, right? So when we go and say CRT, they always say, we're not teaching CRT, show me the curricula. Can't, because that's not the way you implement CRT. It is not an academic discipline. It is taking a lens and empowering those teachers with the vocabulary to take the context of the daily experience into a racial domain at all times. Now, before I go in, I'll take some questions. Any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's not important to talk about the Marxist, the Frankfurt School and the history and that aspect of the agenda behind it?
Well, this is the thing, and I don't think that parents make decisions based on whether or not something is Marxist or not. They make a decision based, because quite frankly, most people don't know what it means. And most people aren't going to read about it. There are those of us who remember Marxism, that we've read the literature, remember from college, that we're, I'm going to say, more on the patriotic side, so aware of these theories and ideologies. And that's fine, but I think you lose 80% of the people when you start talking about Marxism, right? Now, I think you get more people back when you make it personal, right? I mean, come on, what outcome do they expect? Say, let's all believe we're all racist. I'm up here being oppressed. You guys are out there oppressing me. Now what? Right? Where does that go? But it's very real if I have a third grader sitting next to another third grader. One's black, one's white. They're friends, But then their teachers start to tell them that that white friend is going to be your oppressor one day, if not already, and tells the black kid, and it tells the white kid that he can't help it, but he's going to be an oppressor. What happens in that kid's mind? How does it affect his interaction with other races, with other people? Will he stay friends with that person? You want to be best friends with someone whom you're convinced you're going to oppress at some point in time? What does that do for children's mental health? Now, I can tell you from my experience in that belief in the black community, doesn't do anything good. Any others? Mm-hmm. Yep.
I get that it's maybe a little bit covert, there's not a curriculum, but how do you link the equity and equality discussion that we see very overtly in schools being taught with a CRT? I do see that as extremely overt.
How many of you have kids? How many of your kids at some point in time yelled at you and told you something wasn't fair? What did that mean? They didn't like it. The reason why they talk about equity and fairness is because it cannot be defined. And they want us to try to define it. But these are words that everyone knows. Someone says, that's not fair. Everybody kind of gets it, but no one can define it. So equity, I mean, think about the concept of equity. People say that they believe in science. Equity does not exist in nature. It doesn't. Balance exists. But equity and fairness are not scientific or natural constructs. The natural construct is survival of the fittest. So if you want people to have a better chance at equitable survival, the only way you can do that is to teach them, make them more fit to survive. But even if you do that, at the end of the day, they have to do the surviving. You can't be someplace starving and need water. I can't show up and give you water and food and leave and you just sit in the desert waiting for me to come back. You will not survive. So it is a dangerous paradigm to focus on equity and fairness. And I'm going to get to some numbers that I will prove to you tonight that it is impossible for race to be the basis of any of this, that it has no impact. And there's data that shows that white privilege doesn't even exist. Okay? So let's talk about CRT in Virginia. This is from the Virginia's website and how they define it. So this happened in February of this year on the 25th, there was a bill signed into law, and they didn't do it through the curricula side, they did it through the HR side. And what this law did was it made cultural competency training mandatory all over Virginia. So it's not just Loudoun or Fairfax, it's every single school district in the Commonwealth of Virginia, okay? And as I said before, it's not being taught as critical race theory, it's being taught from this lens view to the teacher. And the teachers must undergo the training and they must show competence as part of their evaluation. What happens if your evaluation goes bad? You lose your job. It's required for all licensed professionals, and it's required of all future hires that will become teachers or licensed professionals in the school district, yes.
Is that what they call transformative social and economic learning? Is that what they're going to?
So what they've done is they call it cultural competency at the legislative level. And then when you go to the Virginia site, and the site's there, then they expand what they mean by that, right? So the first piece was the law. So they don't say critical race theory, but they say in Virginia, this is from their site on anti-racism in education. It says social structures that exist in society are frequently based on race. Schools do not merely inherit or manage racial ethnic identities, they create and enforce racial meaning. This is the Commonwealth saying this, okay? School structures, the conditions for the embodiment, performance, and/or interruption of sustained and unequitable racial formations. So they're basically saying that the school's making you racist. As long as students and staff are insulated from the realities of racism that will have little reason to change their behavior or attitude, anti-racism requires acknowledging that racist beliefs and structures are pervasive in education and then actually doing the work to tear down these beliefs and structures. So that's from the website. It's called Virginia for Learners, virginia.gov. So that is a perspective that hits the tenet, right? I'm changing the lens that everything is racist. Okay? On the same site, this is their definition that they publish to the teachers and to the public. Systemic racism is defined as a way in which institutional policies and practices create barriers for communities of color based on race and ethnicity. It is the written and unwritten rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern an organization and produce or sustain racial inequity between or among racial groups, thereby marginalizing some groups or creating unfair barriers for them to access valuable benefits and opportunities. This is often the result of bias within the system of institutional practices that may appear neutral, but in fact privileges some groups while simultaneously disadvantaging others. This is better known as disparate impact. This is from the Virginia website for the state. Okay? So, and then finally, it says conversations and strategies planning around racial equity that does not include systemic analysis of racism helps to maintain the systemic oppression of students of color. In doing so, students are hurt. Systematic racism impacts student learning, resulting in disparate educational outcomes, but also has a significant impact on student social, emotional well-being. How can I say this? From a broader perspective, I think that the dialogue on racism is so convoluted that no one bothers to try to quantify it, right? It's emotionally charged. They use emotional language, right? And the reason why we cannot seemingly find solutions to things is because we haven't identified it. The example I always use is this. Your kid tells you that there's a monster in the closet or under their bed. Now, he can only see it, the shadow, when the lights are off, okay? And when he stares at it, it seems to move. So to him, it's a real thing. But when you come and turn the light on, there's nothing there, right? Embracing critical race theory is saying, okay, let's assume the boogeyman's real. And let's do the things to protect you from the boogeyman. Right? So you say, okay, when the boogeyman disappears, he's ghosting you. Or when the boogeyman does this, and you come with this whole vocabulary, and you and your kids are having a deep, developed conversation, analyzing something that actually doesn't exist. So that's why I was like, and to me, it is really that. And I'll get back to something. Now this statement, let me go, I gotta go back, but here we go. This statement in its definition is dangerous. Okay? Colorblind racism, a post-civil rights approach that essentially denies the subtle forms of discrimination that have replaced the blatant or explicit racism of the past. The colorblind approach ignores the evidence that skin color plays a powerful role in shaping an individual's life experience and denies the immeasurable damage of a dynamic system of oppression against people of color based solely upon a false notion or assumption of superiority by the dominant group. Again, this is on the Virginia. This is what the Virginia's teaching. And it's a direct attack on the entire civil rights movement. And it's a direct attack that the entire goal of our society is to be colorblind. It is dangerous. You get some kid believing that, God bless you. So these are some pieces. This is from the Loudoun County website, right? Calls for all students, staff, families, and other members of the community to engage in disruption and dismantling of white supremacy, systemic racism, and hateful language and actions based on race, religion, country of origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, and/or ability. LCPS rejects racist or other hateful behavior or language recognizing it encourages domination, hatred, oppression, and violence. That's on their website. Yep.
What's confusing to me is that they're asking these questions in some school districts already, It's illegal. You cannot ask a kid a religion in school. You cannot ask about their sexual orientation. Those are things that are off limits. So why is this all of a sudden allowed? Why isn't a court of law being able to just nip this, at least a portion of it?
Laws don't act on themselves, right? It's like if you have a patent. You have the legal right to sell that and deny other people the right to do it. But if someone sells it, the government's not going to come protect you. You have to sue, right? So the law just gives you recourse, but you have to find the grounds of statute in which to exercise your recourse, right?
New Jersey, because of exactly these things.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see, that's from No Left Turn in Education. So it'll be interesting if it comes out, but I'm just surprised more people have not, because there are a lot of angry people out there.
I will tell you that probably most people don't believe that it exists. Because you go and you sit down with your neighbor and you say, you know, there's CRT in the schools? Oh, no, there's no CRT in the schools. You have the superintendent coming up. No, it's not CRT, right? And so you sit there not taking action because you're uncertain. A lot of people, you're busy raising your families and things like that, and you're just uncertain about what it isn't, how do you address it. You don't understand it yourself. File a lawsuit about what?
Well, to me, I don't, the fact that a school system embraces equity is evidence that CRT is there.
Yeah, it's a code word. All they've done is change the vocabulary far enough. The people that are doing the consulting knows what they're doing. They just change the words far enough so you don't pick it up. This is taken from the Prince William County material, some material that was given to me. This is the definitions in their teacher training. One of the definitions, color blindness, concept of race-based differences do not matter. The concept that race-based differences do not matter, that ignores the realities of systemic racism. Colorblind comments may focus on content of character. This is what's being taught to Prince Williams County teachers. That is a direct affront to, they're calling out Martin Luther King. And they're calling out to every parent that says, I want my child to be judged on his character. And in their training material, they're basically pushing back on that. Fairfax County, you may have, this is from the superintendent, you may have feelings of hopelessness right now. However, we can take action. We know that our work as educators is one action that we can change the future by teaching about systemic injustice and learning about the value of diversity of all forms. We will share additional resources with you this week in support of this important dialogue as you process thoughts, feelings, and with the adults, and especially the children around you. So this idea of systemic injustice, why would you talk to a kid about systemic injustice? And how do you define systemic injustice, right? So this is CRT affirmation. Again, this is from their book. I read it again. It was torture because it was filled with so much ridiculousness. By contrast, many critical race theorists and social scientists hold that racism is pervasive, systemic, and deeply ingrained. If we take this perspective, the no white member of society seems quite so innocent. The interplay of meanings that one attaches to race, the stereotypes one holds to other people, the standards of looks, appearance, beauty, and the need to guard one's own position will powerfully determine one's perspective. From their guide, the tenets that they have at a high level. The first, racism is ordinary and not aboriginal. In other words, it's just normal, it's everywhere. Don't think about it, don't worry about it. And if you don't believe me, if you want to be colorblind, you must be a racist. The usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. So that's what it's saying. It's everywhere, you can't get around it. If you go by a candy bar, somehow you can find something racial in it, right? Yep.
Do we know the book Critical Race Theory? Are these white authors or black authors?
Black authors. Yeah, they're mostly black authors. Well, let me correct that. It references source materials. They're black authors primarily. When it moves into the education domain, then it switches to where there are more white advocates. So Now, it's odd, but yeah, it's people hating themselves. But it's from like writings from the 70s. I tell you, I spent, before I launched this, I spent 6 weeks in what I call a deep dive in CRT just to make sure that I knew what I was talking about and that I wasn't going by impression. So I bought the books, I looked up, I said, what are the books that they're reading? I used to be president of the Harvard Black Alumni Society, and I have a bunch of CRT people in there. So I just called them up and asked them. So they gave me a list of books to read. So I went and I bought the books, I read them. Some of them were so bad I had to listen to an audiobook because the logic I couldn't follow. And then it sounds really intellectual because they give all these references. But when you go to the references, a lot of them are nonsensical or people that were deemed crazy in the 70s. One that was nonsensical is it tried to have a justification of reparations based upon denied reparations to Native Hawaiians. Okay, now the people that are supposed to get this in Hawaii are still alive. And the reparations they were supposed to get was there were government lands that were taken, there were lands taken by the government, and the reparation was supposed to be to return the land to the Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian people. Very real. People are alive, the government has the asset, they're holding it, they could just give it back. So, but if you read the text, it sounds very intellectual that there's a real reason for reparations. But when you read the reference, it has nothing to do with it. And the whole book is like this. I went through 1,200 pages of reference material, and all of it was garbage. It was unsubstantiated authors that were laughed at in the 70s. Stuff that just didn't fit together. I mean, what was the one author? How did he say it? Christianity supports white supremacy, therefore Christianity must be eradicated. And you're like, where did that come from?
And they use that to take, to permit the 501c to that recent church, because they say the Bible pushes for republicanism.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're not going to give you, money goes to them, so we're not going to give you your 501c.
Oh yeah, you're right. Second tenet is most would agree, and this is them, they most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group.
Both psychic and material?
It's in their book, I didn't write it. I don't even know what that means, except that, you know, they're saying that all of that it's essential for, let me go back? Okay. And then the third of critical race theory is the social construction thesis, which holds that race and races are products of social thought and relation. So basically, what's the name of the book? Have you guys ever read Marx? And the part when he talks about families? He comes out and he says, okay, the government oppresses the people. So the men in society want someone to oppress. So they get married so they can oppress their wives. Now the wife wants someone to oppress, and together they agree to have children so they can oppress their children. I read this in like the 10th grade. I had tears streaming down my eyes because I couldn't believe anybody believed this stuff. And that whole countries were putting up systems of government. Did who here marry their wife to exploit them? Moms who had kids because you had a craving for someone of your own to exploit? And that was their logic, that children should be loyal to the state, to the people, and not to their parents, because their parents only wanted to oppress them. Those chores, that's oppressive. So we oppose it for some very simple reasons. CRT is an effort, we understand CRT is an effort to understand racial disparity. So we also, it seeks to explain current day American racial differences by viewing it in the light of its history. In other words, no one ever can point to anything today that does it, or directly. They have to kind of go around the willy and say, oh, it's because of all this stuff happened in the past, 150 years ago, 50 years ago, that it must apply today, right? And it says, but our assertion is that the CRT approach should be able to demonstrate that the application of the principles listed above would create better outcomes for Black Americans and people of color. So in other words, it has to have some tangible, to be valid, it would have to have some evidence-based way to show that embracing this ideology makes things better. It can't be done. They assert, but it can't be done. So my big thing is data, history, and looking at the facts. So does the data support the cause of racial disparity, a racial cause to disparity? It doesn't. And I'm going to give it to you by the numbers, okay? So Black poverty in 1959 was these are from the US Census data. So I'm not making these up. This is government data. Black poverty was 55% in 1959. By 1968, it was 34%. Guess what it was at the end of the Civil War? 100%. Right? So keep that in mind. We have Jim Crow, we have no civil rights, but you go from 100% to 66% in 100 years. Okay? So 68, 34%. In 2018, it was at 20.7%. Okay, now they have numbers after that. It did drop under the Trump administration to 18.7, but the data is not fully in. But you'll see that Black poverty is almost 3 times lower over a 50-year period, over that time period. Okay, let's look at white poverty. 1959, white poverty was 18.1%. In 1968, white poverty was 10%. In 2018, white poverty was 11.8%. Now, if the system is geared to benefit whites and not blacks, somebody explain that to me. Again, these are US Census numbers. The data is saying that no, in fact, if you go from 1968 to present day and you track the Black poverty rate across the country over that 50, 60-year period of time, it stays at about 10%. Sometimes it's 9.7, but it never goes below about 9.6. And it jumps back up to around 12% if there's a recession. If you average it out, it was 10% in 1968 and has been about 10% ever since. Recently, in 2008, it started to rise a little bit above the numbers, but it averages out to 10% for 50 years. Whereas in the Black community, it's a third of what it was 50 years ago. So if the system is there to benefit the white race, it's not doing a very good job. Again, this is from the 2019 census report, census evaluation. That bottom line, that's white poverty. That top line is Black poverty. All racial groups are getting out of poverty, whereas whites are flat. And that chart represents 60 years. If racism was systemic, you would see the white poverty line going down and all the other races going up. It does exactly the opposite. Oops. Oh, there we go. Does that make any questions there? Are you surprised by the numbers? It's flat. So there is no basis for to say there's systemic racism. Because what? If what they say is true, then white progress would advance and others would not. It's the opposite. White progress is flat. All other minorities are falling. Okay? Let's look at some other numbers. Let's break it down. When we talk about the poverty, what are we talking about? Married Black people, married Black Americans, 2018, poverty rate was 18.8%. This is among couples. The poverty rate among the single moms was 31.8%. Significantly higher. Among white American couples, 7.8%. Among single white mothers, 23.2%. So there are social, economic underpinnings to poverty. Now, when you look at the big numbers where it says there, white single moms is about 24% of the white population. Single Black moms is about 65% of the population. So you have to look, there's greater numbers in poverty in the Black community. But when you start to look at the progress when applied to two parent couples, it's much more significant. And this is from the census data. Didn't make this up. The census data tracks all of this stuff. Okay? Tracks all this data. So you sit there, you look at the information, you say to yourself, okay, the data doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the narrative. It is impossible for what they're asserting to be true. Right? It's impossible. So then the question becomes, why do we have disparity and why does it continue? Because it exists, right? It exists in some places. If you look at my website, we did a report on Virginia. Virginia has no black-white disparity at all. 40% of Virginia schools, blacks graduate at a higher rate. There are 8 schools in Virginia that have double-digit graduation gaps, 8 districts. But in 4 of the districts, the blacks have a double-digit lead over whites. In 80% of Virginia schools, black graduation rates are over 90%. And then when you break it down from 91% to 95%, that accounts for another 5 to 6. Another 5 to 6% is in that, right? So we have significant numbers. We have significant numbers that tell us that there isn't a gap. Now, think about this. If you have 40% of the school districts where blacks outperform whites, so basically, when the schools are poor, white students underperform black students. And the data is, I think I said it before, I say this so much I lose track of, so pardon me. In Baltimore, the 73 to 72, right, and the 54. It's the same thing in Chicago, same thing in Los Angeles. It's the same thing all over the country. In Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia. When people are poor, people are poor. Everyone that lives in that zone suffers. It doesn't matter what color you are. So let's get to the root cause of how we got here. And this is proof that racism has no role in the disparity we see today. And I have to thank my mom for this because, I had remembered stories that she told me. And when I looked and researched the other data, I had to ask the question, so if it's not this, then what? Right? So there's another piece that I'll probably, it is in there. All right, so let's give the big number, and it's probably out of order. So if you think about poverty at 100%, say 1868, right? Being into Reconstruction, that kind of thing. So I'm gonna look at 100 years from 1868 to 1968, right? So I've already said, so blacks started at 100% poverty, no land, no resources, and 90% of blacks lived in the South, okay? By 1959, it dropped to 55%. In a 3-year period, black poverty dropped 13.3%. 3 years. And you have to say, and this was under Jim Crow and during segregation. You say, well, how did that happen? Well, post-war, people don't realize, maybe you guys do, America didn't have immigration between the Great Wars or after the Great Wars. So you had about 500,000 blacks pulled into the northern worker market after World War I. You had about 5 million pulled into the worker market after World War II. And the reason for that, there was no immigration, so there was no labor coming in. We did not have any form of globalization because the world was in shambles and we made everything ourselves because that was the result of the war. Everything was manufactured internally, okay? The men came back from war. The women went back home. There was a labor vacuum because the industrial expansion started after World War II. It got so bad that northern companies were sending recruiting teams down south to pull black people off of plantations and farms to work in plants in the north. It happened so much, the South passed laws against northerners recruiting black workers. Almost half of the black population relocated post-war to 1968 to the north and west. Okay? Huge number of people. Where do you think they went to? Every city that shows a problem today, that's where they went. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is this. One of the most significant factors, I think I said all this stuff already, so I'm gonna skip past it. Yep, don't care about that. One of the most significant factors in this whole thing was that when they went north, the migrants averaged 6.9 years of education. So about a sixth grade education. So you basically had a bunch of people with a sixth grade education going to Los Angeles, Chicago, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Indianapolis. They move into these cities for manufacturing jobs. And when we looked at the numbers before, it went from 66% improvement over 100 years. So let's average it out. 33% over 50 years. So the 50 years previous to 1968, 33% improvement. It's a little more than that, but let's just go there. We get to 1968 to 2018, only a 12% improvement. So 33% under Jim Crow, no civil rights, and no government programs, all that poverty was eliminated. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. That's why I use that as a barrier. When you say Civil Rights Acts, there was a body of them, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, yada, yada, although they go together. So I picked 1968 because that's when the last major piece of civil rights legislation was passed. And from there until now, there's only been a 12% improvement, decrease in poverty. Right? Does that make sense to anybody, that would happen? So you have to ask the question, why did that happen? What happened at the end of the 60s and early 70s? We went globalized. See, that's a myth. The government programs didn't do it. Some black mother didn't say, well, I'm gonna go to welfare check. Honey, you get out. That didn't happen. What happened is when we opened up the world, that's when our manufacturing jobs started to go overseas. And that's when plants started closing down in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, et cetera, et cetera. And you had because of segregation, the blacks were clustered in overpopulated communities. So you have a sixth grade education, you've only done manual jobs that you were recruited for, and then all those jobs move overseas. What's gonna happen? You have concentrated institutional poverty in that population. There's no adaptation to the knowledge economy at all, right? Black schools didn't go bad. They were never any good. Nobody cared about a black person's education when we were in a factory. Just like nobody cared about a coal miner's education when he was digging rock. Nobody cared. But when those industries now, what do programs do? What normally happened in history before this, when the industry went bust, people migrated to new areas. Once you introduce government programs to it, you're paying them to stay in the blighted area. So rather than going and finding the job, you're paying people to stay where there is no job. And that's how the government programs create poverty clusters. And once you have those poverty clusters institutionalized, men and women and families have an economic relationship, right? It's economic contract. That's broken. Once that's broken, you tend to get a rise in single parentage. Right? And that has consequences, big consequences. What are some of the consequences? Well, 80% of those incarcerated for violent crimes came from a single parent household and doesn't have a high school diploma. Prison recidivism. 85% of prisoners released from prison, this is in Virginia, without a high school diploma is back in prison within 10 years. Only 40% of Virginia prisons have education programs. Now let's go on the flip side. A prisoner that gets an education in prison, their recidivism goes from about 85% to about 45%. If they get a master's degree, it's at 12%. If they get anything above a net master's, it's so statistically small, they get like one guy might come back in 10 years. Costs $37,000 per year to incarcerate someone. Costs $12,000 per year to educate them. You could get them out in 4 years and they never come back. Right? So that's what we're talking about. So we talk about that great expansion, and you'll get all this material. So then let's talk about why it's been 50 years and we've had public education in Baltimore and places like that. Why hasn't it changed anything? Why hasn't it made a difference? Right? So I'm going to refer to you. There's 2 studies. First study, this is the 1980s, and it was a study by 2 University of Kansas researchers called Hart and Risley. And what they did is they put listening devices in the homes of middle and upper middle class families and the home of welfare families. They looked at how they were performing, and older kids were performing in school, but each of the houses had to have preschoolers in it. And what they recorded is that the white children in the upper middle class homes or middle class homes heard 3 times as many words as the kids from the welfare home. And that when they tracked it, their school performance reflected the number of words that the kids heard before school. And it affected them for their entire life. Now, from a brain standpoint, in the back of your head is something called a phonological loop. And what it does is, it is your center for brain recognition, which is why your kid grows and starts to talk first before they do anything else. The brain actually matures from back to front. Language to logic. Okay? So when a child is read to, that's why reading to a child works, right? When a child is read to, it kickstarts brain development. And these things called neurological connections, right? So there's a thing called synapses. If I get too geeky, tell me to shut up. But there's this thing called synapses. And the way you remember things is you have all these little fingers out there, and there's billions of them. When you learn something new, they pull together and they stick. And if you don't use something, they get weakened and they fall apart. Okay? So when you're born, you have connections that you have too many. They're not used. So your brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning. And it's a survival of the fittest paradigm. Your brain, when you go through your day, 20% or 25% of your calories are consumed by your brain doing nothing. Right? Your brain takes a lot of energy just to exist and operate. So this pruning process takes place, through the teen years where the brain is breaking off connections, and if you don't use them, it goes away. And if there are weak connections or neurological cells that aren't very good, those break off first. It's survival of the fittest. A child that is stimulated when they're young, their brain formation is completely different from a kid that doesn't get the stimulation. So if you have somebody coming north with a 6.9 year education, chances are that in their household, their families, those children will not be receiving a lot of stimulation. And so you will have systemic academic underperformance. And until you fix that, so the key to a better school is actually to make a better student, not the other way around. Another study, Peter Drucker worked with Japan after World War II. Peter Drucker reports a study with one of his colleagues where they took a graduating class. And this graduating class, they followed for 10 years after graduation. Now, he wanted to find out what was common about those who were more successful or less successful than others, right? So what he did, you can't ignore, I'm just making sure I don't miss anything. What he did was he gave them tests, IQ, aptitude, all kinds of tests, right? And only one test reflected the way their success in life. Now, success was defined as stability of relationship and economic self-reliance. That's it. Happy, good relationships with people, and you can pay for yourself. Some of the smartest people were homeless. Some of the most average people were successful beyond belief. One test they all took were the ones who scored high were successful, and the ones who scored low, despite IQ, were unsuccessful. It was a vocabulary test. So these two studies together tell us why, after 50 years, we still have these problems concentrated in Black communities. Now, the same testing, the same scores are reflected by white and Hispanic people who live in the same poverty clusters. Let's get that clear, right? So it's a human problem. It's not racially based. They all test the same. In fact, if we have one group that is in urgent need of intervention, it is the Hispanic Latino community. Because at home, they're bilingual, and so it impacts school performance, which is why you'll see 70%, you'll see Hispanic Latino people, students, at about 20% below Blacks, all over the country. Because no one's paying attention to the language component in early childhood development. Let's go by study NIH reports. They say, we'll give them universal pre-K. The effects of universal pre-K, according to NIH, dissipates after the 3rd grade. So how do you fix that? We have programs in the country that have proven that you can reverse it. Have you ever heard of Success Academies in New York City? Success Academies is a charter school in New York City. What they did to address the problem is they have a rigorous reading program that starts from kindergarten through 12th grade. Mandatory reading list, parental involvement, et cetera, et cetera. Primary focus is reading, and they outscore, they're all minority students, Black and Latino and Hispanic, and they outscore everyone else on average statewide because of reading programs. So we have solutions, right? So the takeaway is it's not systemic racism. We have systemic poverty that is a direct result of segregation and education policies before 1968. The systemic racism was abolished through legislation. But the effects of systemic racism concentrated poor, undereducated citizens. We never dealt with that. And when you put government assistance on top of it, you're paying people to be poor in place. And we know that the programs don't work to reduce poverty. Thinking about the numbers, what can you say that absolutely proves that government programs can't reduce poverty? Well, I go to New York, and they say Manhattan got better, or this part of Boston got better. But when you look at the national number for whites, it's still 10%. They're shuffling the deck. The percentage of poor overall stays the same in government programs. In the Black community, 12% over 50 years is not a lot. But if you go to individual municipalities, they'll claim they made great progress. All they did was price them out and the people moved on. Giuliani knew that. You know, in New Jersey, in southern New Jersey, the towns down there were having a problem to where they were, poverty was building. So they changed the zoning laws that you couldn't have any more than 3 children and a parent in a house. They increased the tax, and all that did is moved all the poor people out. Everyone you hit 5 kids, can't live there in that town. They just changed the zoning laws. And it's one of the wealthiest cities in New Jersey now. How's it illegal? Yeah, you can do that. They have occupancy rules here. Remember back in like 2007, 2008 when it was before Airbnb, and a lot of people renting out houses in Northern Virginia, but like bringing in like 8, 9 people. You don't see that anymore very much. You know why? They made it illegal.
Well, I get why you can't have 20-something people in a small space, fire hazards and all of that. It just sounds like, based on what you're explaining, that it's far.
But what's the right number?
I would imagine there's got to be something health-based.
It doesn't have to be. You have too much trust. It's just math.
Nobody pushed back. I guess the people didn't know that they could, or they didn't have the resources to do it. Or nobody did it for them, or nobody cared to do it for them.
Yeah, nobody cared to do it for them. Knowledge, they don't have the knowledge to do it. Don't have the money, don't have the knowledge. What do? You get up and you move. Of course they don't care. Think about this. It is an argument.
a certain minority group and or minorities in general, and they're for the people, but why are they not there when it counts?
Think about this. Loudoun County has 6.7% black school population. 6.7% black school population in Loudoun County, right? The black graduation rate is 1.9% behind the white graduation rate, statistically insignificant. It is one of the best, it is one of the smallest graduation gaps in the country. Of a large school system, Loudoun County is numero uno. There is no issue with black performance there. Why is the NAACP going in there? Writing reports, talking about anti-racism, et cetera, right? If you go by the logic, the outcome that you want from a school is a graduation rate and going on to college. Well, Loudoun is in the top 5 nationally, if not higher. What's the point? Everything that happened there, kids bully, kids tease, right? If somebody's sick, you know how kids are. A kid might say something to somebody about their race. Black kid says the white kid says the black kid. You know, somebody says something to Hispanic kid, but there's also, you're tall, you're short, you're fat, you're ugly. I don't like your hair. Those are terrible clothes. Your sneakers are bad. That's what kids do. What they never tell you is they take one report that there's some racism in school. Well, how many incidents were there? And how does that compare to incidences of other types of bullying? They will never tell you that. And you know why they won't? Because it's the same. It's kids being kids. It's not racism. It's kids just being jerks. You made them all the time.
I have a question. With the graduation rate of what you had just said, how can they, with a straight face, even dare to look at the lens to look at the alleged racial disparity through CRT when it comes to graduation? I don't know.
The reason for that is that most parents don't pay attention to that fact. I'll bet you most people didn't know this stuff till I just said it to you. You know why? Because you've been conditioned to believe that there's disparity in racism. You assume it all the time, and you never check.
The thing that's confusing is why would the NAACP, of all organizations, be pushing this, knowing full well that they're going to destroy what's already been done, the success that's been made?
What does a lack of racism in society mean for the NAACP? Yeah. You're never going to admit that we won. They're never going to admit that we won. Never. Yeah, it's politics and perception. They're never going to admit we won. But by the data, we're winning. If we can deal with these, I'm going to call them systemic education issues that are legacies of past racism, then we can move everybody forward. You know, we just have to, I mean, there's other things like, for example, you know, the list, reading rigor, right? We you know, it seems these days, at least with my kids, after a certain grade, when my kids got to like the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, you know, the rigor of the books that they got weren't books that gave them new vocabulary. They were more entertaining. And they recycle the same words over and over again. It's not just reading. It has to be challenging reading, right? And they've changed the books so they're not challenging. You don't need to look, you don't need, I remember I was taught to read with a highlighter, and I would read it through first the night before the class, and I would highlight every word that I didn't know, and I would look those up, and then I would read it again so that I understood it. So I was constantly getting higher vocabulary. I mean, John Updike, read his stuff. You go to the first paragraph, I don't know what the heck he said. You know, it was the age of incredulity. Who says that? But what do? You look it up, open up, Edgar Allan Poe. You start the house of, reading that book of the House of Usher, the House of Usher. The whole paragraph is a bunch of 4-syllable words that nobody in the 8th grade should know and be saying, but that was our reading assignment, and we kept those cards, and we did the vocabulary, and we rolled through it, right? Now, if they can pronounce the word, the teacher's fine. So reading rigor, and it's just and it's challenging. And the other thing you realize, when it comes to that whole synaptic pruning thing, it's actually more benefit for a child to learn something they don't like than something that they do like. Because the reason why a child likes something and is talented is because their brain has already formed the connection to accommodate it. And it's only by stepping outside their element that they actually force brain formation before it slows down. For guys, 24 is when we're growing up. We literally aren't fully grown until we're 24. Women, their brains are basically fully grown at 16. Yeah, we don't have impulse control till we're 24. See, you knew there was something wrong with us, didn't you? Why is he doing that? Oops. So here, there are ways to address it if you look at facts and data. Right now, it's just any questions you want, complaints.
When we talked to you a few weeks ago, you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, about the percentage of the Black population that's middle class.
Yeah. People don't. So there's a juxtaposition. If you most of the middle class Black community is in the married side. So we have about 22%, 24% of the people that are married, almost all of them in the middle class. Now, notice this number that they capture here with single mothers and their poverty rate, right? But Black men are 54% in the middle class. They just aren't getting married. Right? But we're represented by the law, by our people that go to jail, right? I mean, what is the guy, Floyd, whatever? The guy's a criminal, he gets a monument. You'll never hear from a Black male that's doing. Sometimes I'm treated like I'm a unicorn when I'm actually the majority. So but this is the fight that we have to fight for the country, right? This is the fight that we have to fight for parents. We have to understand that we've been living in a reality distortion field. And we have been having conversations around race that are not based in fact. And so when someone comes to us, and now are there bad actors? Yes, right? But I will tell you, a lot of things a lot of things will be subjective. Like when I was a VP at a medical firm decades ago, and Weston, Massachusetts is a really wealthy community, and Natick is right next to it, and my office was in Natick. So I would drive down the parkway through Weston to come to my office, and every darn day, or at least 3 times a week, I got pulled over. It was always a different cop. Right? So I'm like, very polite, I was on my way. Didn't get upset about it. I just made an appointment at the police station with the chief and said, my name is Paul Lott, here's my business card, I work here, stop pulling me over. Now, Weston is 99.9% white. Was the policeman wrong for pulling me over because I didn't fit in with the community? My answer is no. He wasn't wrong. He's doing his job. He was looking at anything out of place. Right? That's what he's doing. We all profile. We all do. It's actually part of our survival instinct. We all generalize. We will never do deep studies on each other. But what we've allowed is a media that puts out an image of different groups of people to become the default way of living. Now I'll make a statement. I've been argued about this from some of my friends. What if I told you America was never racist and that I can prove it? He's heard the lecture. Anybody had a term called draptomania? Draptomania. Draptomania. If you look it up, it was in the DSM. It was an official mental illness. And draptomania was what a slave suffered through that made them want to escape. So wanting to be free from slavery was a mental illness. And do you know what the prescription to avoid this, to treat this disease was? This is in the Fisher U.S. book. To beat the devil out of them. So science told them that blacks were born to be slaves. Science told them the symptoms were unnecessary sadness, slowness in doing their work, and general melancholy. When you see these symptoms, the slave will eventually want to escape. The only way is to take the preventative maintenance of beating it out of them. So people will talk how vicious the slave owners were, and they paint that picture when it was in the government manual as a mental illness. They were following the science. The Civil War, what led up to the Civil War was not the abolitionist movement. Did you know that? Because white America said, some of these plantations have 100 black people or 4 white people. If they didn't want to be slaves, they just rebelled. 3 slave rebellions took place. That's what triggered the Civil War. That was when white society finally realized that blacks didn't want to be slaves. And the Civil War quickly followed. There was another thing that happened. Abraham Lincoln wanted to abolish slavery, but he didn't have confidence that blacks could function in society on par with white Americans. So Frederick Douglass used to be called the House of the People, knocked on Abraham Lincoln's door every week and sat down and had conversations with him. And the intellectual prowess of Frederick Douglass is what convinced Lincoln that we could be free and we could function on equal grounds with white America. But they were following the science. In the Age of Enlightenment, there were multiple textbooks that had pictures and graphs about how we evolved to be subservient and that we're incapable of being independent. The powerful science can be political. Think about it, 10,000 years. 10,000 years, a baby was a baby. All of a sudden in 1972, it's a tissue. At the same time, when they want to make legal the destruction of a life, right? Science is a method, not a conclusion. When people start using it as a conclusion, you gotta go, but remember that, Draconomania, it's real. And it explains a lot. Even if you look at the attitudes of white Americans from 1868 on, I'll give you something you probably didn't know. Blacks voted in the South during slavery. Did you know that? Free blacks voted all the time and nobody cared. Slaves just couldn't vote. The Constitution doesn't, the 3/5 compromise, it doesn't even mention the race. It says if those who are slaves are counted as 3/5 because the founding fathers, okay, this is how non-racist your country is. The South wanted a country that had slaves. And the Northerners, but the Virginians were wise on this side. They wanted a country, the Virginia leaders wanted a country that had slaves in it, so that eventually they could get rid of it. If you had a Southern slave country, what legislative pressure is there to ever get rid of it? But if you have a union with North and South, slave and free, based on a constitution and a Declaration of Independence that declares all men are created equal, you form one country, and then you work to get rid of slavery. And that's what they did. That's what the 3/5, read it, take it out and read the Constitution. It doesn't mention the race of the person. And why was it 3/5? The South wanted to have all slaves counted 100% so that they got more congressional seats. If they had gotten those congressional seats, I'd be a slave now. So the 3/5 compromise that even black people cry about, well, we weren't fully human, they demeaned us. No, they were saving your life. That's the Constitution people don't know about. That's why it was in there. That's why they wanted both countries together, right? Abraham Lincoln was smarter than that. So when they declared war, The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves. It only freed the slaves in rebel states. There were 5 states that didn't rebel, that still had slaves. That's why we need the 13th Amendment. Read the Emancipation Proclamation. It says nothing about freeing all slaves. It says that the slaves in rebel zones are thereby free. Juneteenth is a meaningless holiday. It's just for Texas. That is not the day all slaves were free. All slaves were free in December of 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was ratified 6 months later. There were still slaves walking around D.C. and Maryland after the Civil War. That's the history that people are taught. The country was resolved to get rid of slavery. If they hadn't passed the 13th Amendment, no, they couldn't re-enslave those people, but it would have been legal to get new slaves and take them into the South. And this country ratified this in 6 months, right? They got the majority of the states to ratify. Does that sound like a country that was eagerly to be racist to you? That 6 months after a civil war, state by state, ratified the freedom of the slaves? Doesn't sound like a racist country to me. And that's the end of the history lesson. Any more questions? That's it. Go for it.
What is your sense within the middle-class Black community of their understanding of critical race theory? And
Black intellectuals embrace it. The average middle-class Black person is a Black male. They won't say anything because their friends will disown them. It's a big, you'll find that Black females embrace it, Black males, some embrace it, most of them think they're kind of nuts and don't want anything to do with it. And that's just the way it is.
Why do you think Black females embrace it?
Huh?
Why do you think Black females embrace it?
Do you really want me to answer that question? Because society's not honest to them. Society's not honest to them, with them, right? Think about, Black people have always been the type that responded more to media, right? We have some rappers who dress like a rapper. Girl people do that. Black women have been told, Black women are far more educated in terms of the number that go and complete college. But they're the most unmarried group in the world, literally in the world. And that's because, how can I say this? Whites, Asians, Hispanic watch the same television. Blacks and Black women tend to mimic television more, right? So if something's on television that affirms you and makes you feel powerful, my community mimics it a lot. And so even if so it is just what it is. I don't know what else to say. How do you change that? I think you change it by first, I think you change it by radical intervention into the areas of severe academic underperformance. I think that rather than doing this CRT thing, that money should be best spent on the recruitment of and giving active classes to young mothers, young single mothers, on how to give their child the best chance. I think that there has to be some way to communicate that marriage is not a Disney movie, that you don't even always like your spouse, but it's a partnership arrangement that is financial, but there's a duty, and that more often than not, love is reflected in the continuity and endurance as opposed to the day-to-day emotional ups and downs. I don't think that my community understands that. my community still looks to being Disney princesses. It's real, that's what it is. So I think that efforts have to be made to do that. And we're trying, like in SABA, we put together a 4-week live online class called for Fathers. And we brought people online, and we did a trial during COVID in January and February. And then we did one for women, for single mothers as well. And the idea was just to give people information, teach them whatever. So I had about 40 guys, black guys that signed on from Baltimore. They finished the course. I had about 30 women sign up, 10 finished it. When the point was they didn't want to hear it. I'll put it this way. If you look at the poverty figures among Black Americans, you'll see that the Black American couples in the middle class, because they exceed the median income. Now, in the average family, both people work. And strangely enough, the Black married man earns more money than the unmarried Black man, and that the combination of both incomes is what pushes them into that middle class barrier, right? If you take the same women, it's the lack of a partner that keeps them below the median income. Literally, if you just got married and stuck together, you don't have to talk to each other. If you pooled your resources, it's just a lot cheaper to pool your resources, right? If you pooled your resources and you understood as a mature person that's a huge part of your relationship, right? What is it? Number one reason 80% of Black marriages are ended by the woman. The number one reason is that we grew apart because he was not ambitious enough. So 1 in 4 Black women will ever be married. Why would you have an 80% divorce rate? 80% of those divorced coming up with some dumb reason like that. It's a funny thing. It's just what it is. A lot of hard work. I find I've had to do a lot more fundraising than I care to do, because the way that I want to reach people is this. We put together what we call a summer essentials program. So the logic behind that was simple. America has the shortest school year of every industrial nation on the planet. The standard that we're compared to in Japan and China, they go to school 12 months, right? And they have low dropout rates. Japan's 1.3% year after year. So when we take that PSSA, whatever that test is, and they do all these comparisons, they're actually comparing American kids to kids who have 3 months more per year of school. It's not fair. I don't even look at the results. I'm like, yeah, whatever. But okay, so there's a systemic problem in the public education system, and that it's built like an assembly line. In 2007, I was asked by the State Department, USAID, I used to be like a think tank type of a person, to look at an analysis of how to rebuild a school system in a war-torn country. So Liberia, war, Sierra Leone, West Africa was torn apart. They had sent a bunch of educated American teachers over to try to rebuild the school systems. They failed. And I was running a charity at the time where I did sustainability projects. Like I did simple things. Like, in one country, they were waiting for the UN to build a road because they did have a surplus of food and they wanted to be able to supply food to the cities so the cities wouldn't have to import it. They've been working about 3 or 4 years trying to make this happen. The Belgians had donated about 50 BMWs for them to use for law enforcement and other purposes. A year later, only 1 car was working. No gas stations, no spare parts, no spare tires. Hit a bump in the road and unpaved roads. All the cars were down but 1. They told me I was an idiot because I said, progress is evolutionary. You should give them centuries technology from about the mid-1800s. I said, give them horses. And they told me I was an idiot. Eventually, they ended up doing some of that for some of the field patrols. But the other thing that I did is I said, when they asked me about that particular project, I said, get a civil engineer and send them truckloads of shovels, picks, and axes, and they'll have that road built in no time. They've been waiting 10 years. There was something like 3,000 able-bodied men sitting around waiting. And it worked. Just send them tools. They sent one civil engineer in now, they built dirt roads and broke up rock, but the UN, they wanted to have silly stuff, right? So that's what they said. It said, you did pretty good with that. What can you do with this? And in order to understand why the Americans failed, I had to look at the American school system, and the frailties are pretty significant. First thing, peer leveling. Students aren't promoted by their capability. They're peer leveled, and then they get what's called an accumulative knowledge gap, which accounts, in my opinion, for most underperformance. What do I mean? I have someone in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. If that kid runs into trouble like the fourth or fifth grade, there's pressure by the parents and the system to get him to advance with his friends. And whether or not he's qualified is secondary. And then the whole idea that you can fail 2 classes and pass 3 and move on anyway, that creates an undue stress on the teacher. Back when we look at 1930, right? 1930 to about the 1950s, a teacher could walk into a classroom and there was homogeneous knowledge across the classroom. Every kid in that class was about at that level of smarts. A teacher walks into a classroom today, these kids shouldn't be in there because they actually failed the previous grade, but somehow it was jimmied so they snuck through. These kids are average and should be here, and these kids are so advanced, they're going to get bored. You're asking an American teacher to walk into that classroom and navigate that. And so studies show they usually start to teach towards the lower half of the middle, because that's at a point where we can get some of the kids that are behind and pull them forward, and you can get some.
That's going to be my question to you. Mm-hmm. Trying to dismiss, get rid of advanced placement.
And that's problematic, and I understand that, and that's a statute thing.
Because they're going to gear towards.
So I'll tell you what my opinion is. If you did score right, you wouldn't need advanced placement. You know why? And this is what I'm getting to. We don't promote by knowledge, right? Why do we have grades? Why not just have level 1, level 2, level 3, level, and this is what I did in West Africa. You had 13 levels of math teaching, and you went to the next one when you tested it out of the previous one, period. And you could be 10 years old at level 7, 10 years old at level 3, or 10 years old, because we had situations where 20 kids would show up for class one day, and the next day 100 kids would show up where there was no room even in the classroom, and they had a whole class out on trees. I actually helped develop schools, private schools in Ethiopia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, et cetera, provide curriculum and try to put a structure on it, right? So we have that problem because they're peer locking your kid, and they're not promoting by mastery. Now, that was fine pre-1970. Because think about this, teachers had figured out that interval-based repetition of a lesson, the kid learned it. Rote memory, they would go over it, they would sing songs, they would review it. Teachers were given the time to do this, right? With the adoption of modern education standards, the baseline of SOLs and the baseline of Common Core are a set of international standards that are 12-month standards. It is unfair. Teachers could never have enough time to give children proper reinforcement for them to learn. So those who are bright and have habits of their own will succeed, and those who may be bright who don't have the right habits, they're going to fall behind. And if you have a school that is systemically or consistently underperforming over time, those students don't have the knowledge base on how to self-teach and remediate. Right? Every good student is actually repeating things for themselves. We call it study, but good students are habitually reviewing material in their head to reinforce it, to learn it. Smart kids who are terrible students don't do that. And that's why they can't perform. This is just straight neurology. It's not rocket science. So, but we have these systems in place. Why do we do that? If you want to reform a school, you need to break it apart and have the subjects independent and the child promoted based on knowledge. Period. You don't have a problem with advanced classes anymore, do you? Your 11-year-old can be at in calculus if he wants to.
At elementary school, reading, you had to perfect one level and bring it up to the next. I don't know why they changed it.
You know, they changed it because, you know, it feels, you know, federal money is tied towards certain benchmarks. And as long as money's tied towards the benchmarks, people cheat. You know, the state of Texas got a bunch of federal money over a period of 10 years because they were improving so wonderfully every year. You know how they did it? When the federal law came out, they lowered the testing standards. So they were always testing, and so they were improving, not because their kids were learning more, they were improving because they were changing the test. And 3 people went to jail for that. But they were getting federal money for that. They had 5th graders taking a 3rd grade test the next year, and they were improving. They just relabeled the test, called it something else. There's money involved. So there's that. So there's that thing. Then there's another issue that I call the cumulative learning deficit. Says that it's a fault of the grading system. Again, when the body of knowledge is smaller, teachers could teach it. If you have a time-constrained body of knowledge, there's no room for interval-based repetition, which means you hear it over a couple of days, you have a chance to learn it, right? Simple. If I'm in a math class and I get a C in math, and I go to the next level of math, I've come into that class not knowing 25% of what I should have known. And then I get into that class, and it's the same thing. And I get into that class, it's the same thing. Finally, I get to like the 9th or 10th grade, and I've concluded that I'm no good at math. That's not true. Everyone's a math genius, right? How many times have you been run over by a car? No, really. How many times have you driven to another car because you couldn't figure out the speed and distance of that car? Not really, right? Well, it's not until recently that we could make drones that could do that. So in the fraction of a second, you're calculating your speed, right? Your speed trajectory. You're looking at a moving object, its speed and trajectory, and you're making sure that you both don't occupy the same space at the same time. And you do it in the blink of an eye. Everybody's a math genius. But they don't have time to learn things. I did a study, 120 students in South Chicago, and what we found, most of the kids that struggle with math because of things that they didn't understand the fundamentals. So I made a rule. No one could enter my algebra tutoring program until they could do all of the multiplication tables from 0 to 12, and you had to answer each question in a quarter of a second. And you had to have 5 perfect scores before you could move on to the next part. Right? Why did I do that? Because when I'm sitting there explaining a formula on the board, the kid that's struggling with 5 times 6, 30% of his brain is trying to figure out the math, even though the math isn't even the point. So I wanted them to understand operations, and then boom, 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 boom. So when I'm explaining something on the board, he's completely paying attention because there's no insecurity about mathematical operations. They did it for math, did division, gave them tables, drill, 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 drill. So that's all I have. It's 9 o'clock. Sorry to keep you guys for so long. Thank you so much for coming out.